Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Michael David Fox. I teach in the School of Foreign Service and the History Department here at Georgetown, and I am director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies here in Georgetown. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event, Russia, USSR, and China, Revolutionary Experiences Compared. Before we get started, I just want to thank the Asian Studies Program and its director, Yuki Tajima, for co-sponsoring this event. And I'd also like to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its generous support of our programs. We are involved and just finishing 2 days of intensive workshop discussions in a international project that has brought together 23 specialists in several disciplines, mostly historians, but also political scientists and anthropologists and Slavists, among others, who are, I looked back just to figure out when we started this project, and we first met in March of 2019. Seems like a different era. The organizers who are at this table, we met in London to plan out this project, and now we are approaching kind of completion and the book preparation for the book publication. So this event is to kind of bring us together to discuss what our project has done and our findings. We also have, in addition to the organizers, we have several participants from the project in the audience and some on Zoom. So we have the plan for this event is for each of the organizers to speak for 5 minutes or so. I might speak a little longer, and then open it up to the participants in the project, and then have a discussion with the audience, a kind of a more informal discussion. So does anyone among the organizers have anything to add about the nature and organization of our project before we just introduce what the project is about?
How many obvious similarities societies have. And out of that idea, I'm basically force people to speak to each other by organizing conferences where they could escape. And but that's already a very usual. It's sort of like, what do we have learned? I think, the amount of knowledge acquired on both sides has been enormous, and I think probably something we'll only appreciate over the years, looking back, of just being able to at least sort of navigate another field that is very similar also in terms of, I think, in terms of how we work, how we have to go out into a foreign country to do the research, how the country in question. When we started out, China was the unfreer society. Now I think they're giving a run for each other. But I mean, of course, it makes a particular community in a particular way of how people speak to each other, and in that way, I think the Soviet and the Chinese field seems to be similar, and the more important was that we started together.
So I was remiss in not introducing Juliana first, comes to us from the Center of Contemporary History in Potsdam. Juliana, you need to turn on your microphone there, so it's apparently not on. And let me just introduce my co-organizers: Rana Mitter from Oxford University, Maria Mayofis from Amherst College, and Jennifer Altahanger from Oxford as well. I should also say that the format of this project is somewhat unusual and is designed to bring the two fields that have been rather distant closer together. So we have 2 papers, one from a Russia-Soviet specialist, one from a China specialist, paired together. And then we have a commentator who introduces a moderator who introduces the two and provides a commentary on the two. And then we have the two authors responding to each piece. So this interactive format is, as Juliana said, there's no authoritative work in English on Russia and China, Russia, Soviet Union and China in the 20th century and in English. And that's a pretty startling lacuna. And so that's one that we hope to fill. Anyone else on the organization of our project or anything else connected to that? No, okay. So I'm going to speak first, and then we'll proceed with the panel. For my own part, I'm going to speak rather personally about how this project has affected my own comparison of one important aspect of both countries' cultural revolution. Everyone knows something about Mao's great proletarian cultural revolution and how it profoundly affected China's 20th century and 21st century development. But only specialists tend to be aware that cultural revolution was a key word in the late Lenin's writings in response to earlier trends, and it was transformed into a militant cultural slogan during the initial phase of Stalinism in the late 20s, early 30s. This was the most collectivistic, destructive, anti-traditionalist, class war phase of the Stalin revolution, and that this Stalinist version of a kind of mass action cultural revolution was quickly ended in 1931-32. But also for years in my field in Soviet history, specialists referred to this entire period, 1928-31, as the Cultural Revolution, following one of the most influential books of Soviet history, Sheila Fitzpatrick's Cultural Revolution in Russia, 1928-1931, which was published in 1978. And so I'm going to just tell you two backstories that have shaped my own intellectual odyssey, and better to say probably a backstory within a backstory. The first backstory is that I wrote my dissertation and my first book on Bolshevik Party schools and institutions of higher learning in the 1920s and the early 30s, and I started to become aware of the debates and usages of this term cultural revolution. And as a newly minted PhD, way back in the 1990s, 1998 to be exact, I had a debate with Fitzpatrick, who was then the pace setter in the Soviet field, in the journal Russian Review, about cultural revolution. And I tried to call attention to the complex, long-standing trends inside and outside the Bolshevik Party. And I traced back this urge to create a new kind of socialist culture, to revolutionize culture, to the pre-1914 trend of left Bolshevism, the so-called God builders who were influenced by Nietzsche, the Russian reception of Nietzsche, and the attempt to create a new socialist religion. And they wanted to create a new culture before, unlike the traditional Marxists, creating a new economic base. They thought it was necessary precondition for socialism. And that first backstory explains much of my interest coming into this project. And in 2015, I returned to the topic of cultural revolution in a book that I wrote called Crossing Borders. It contained a more sustained comparison between the usage and phenomenon of cultural revolution in the Russian Soviet context with the Chinese context. And I became aware of a number of major divergences between the Russian Soviet case and the Chinese case, which I think many of which are still valid. I would say that perhaps the most consequential difference was that Stalin presided over the most militant cultural ideological assault on what was called bourgeois leftovers or feudal relics in 1928-31. And then in the mid-30s and late 30s, he oversaw a sharply, what you might call conservative, restoration of hierarchy with a strong streak of veneration of the Russian and imperial past. And Stalin, unlike Mao, was not personally committed to the most radical strains of cultural revolution. He largely outsourced this cultural offensive of 28-31 to the young Turks of the Bolshevik Party, the militant proletarianizers, and then reversed course after collectivization and industrialization drives were sort of destabilized the country. So at that point in 32, most of the radicals were reined in, the dreamers as well, the collectivists and utopians, either cast out or forced to change and adapt. And this brief phenomenon of 28 to 31 was nothing like the truly mass grassroots phenomenon of the Red Guards, for example. Mao presided over the entire course, unlike the Lenin-Stalin succession, the entire revolutionary struggle, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. And this, in China, it released a kind of intense fervor and chaos and disruption of the public order that in its sheer duration and depth, I think, were never matched in the USSR. There was no equivalent of Mao's profoundly destabilizing appeals to youth, to the army, sort of outside, but in the name of the party. So now we come to the second backstory, or the backstory within a backstory. In my debates with Fitzpatrick, I became aware that when Sheila Fitzpatrick was formulating her hugely influential identification of cultural revolution in the Soviet context, she happened to be doing dissertation work in Moscow in the year 1966 to 67, the height of Mao's great proletarian cultural revolution. And in our Russian review exchange, she wrote, and I'm quoting here, "I too started to read the Chinese Cultural Revolution in terms of Soviet historical experience, specifically the cultural political upheaval in Russia in 1928 to 31 that I was currently encountering in my research. I came to the topic of cultural revolution in a very different way from Michael David Fox. He sets out to trace the history of a concept, which means tracing the usages of a term. I, on the other hand, had encountered a historical phenomenon in the course of my empirical research and needed to find a name for it." So to sum up, when I entered this current project, I was used to emphasizing against Fitzpatrick the long-term trajectories of bringing the revolution to the realm of culture, separating the term cultural revolution from its most militant phase of 28 to 31, and insisting that it was more than just mass militancy and ideological action against enemies, although those were the most visible components. And I emphasized differences with the Chinese case, in part because I was reading a somewhat older literature, still valuable, but like, for example, Roderick McFarquhar's still indispensable accounts of Mao and high politics. What this project has given me is an immersion into more recent works on the experience of cultural revolution in China. I would especially single out Barbara Mittler's works grounded in oral history, exploring how culture, she's a member of our project who's here on the Zoom, exploring how culture worked on the ground and how complex it was in this upheaval. And secondly, the works that with greater distance from the 60s have seen how the Cultural Revolution in China was grounded in earlier phenomenon, such as, just as I found it in earlier in the Russian-Soviet case, in the case of the pre-1914 left Bolsheviks, for example, Rana Mitter's work on the May 4th and New Culture movement showing certain long-term trajectories leading up through China's 20th century. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to say that my contribution to this project has been working more closely with colleagues in the Chinese field who are pointing me to the most relevant recent works. And after reading their own works, I've come to stress and come to understand that in particular, what was characterized as the decade after it was over in China, the whole decade of 66 to 76 was condemned, and that affected many, the condemnation affected many of the works in China and then Western works. Now we see a little bit more of how there were phases within that decade, and especially the most militant phase was 3 years, just as in the Soviet case, 66 to 68, and there was a reversal. And so we see, I've come away from this project with an understanding that there was more comparative similarities than I had expected. So I'm going to end there and take my seat and pass it on to my colleague, Rana Mitter, because we're going to alternate Russia, China, if you don't mind. And if you turn on your mic, you have one.
I will throw this one. That's good. Okay, is that coming through? Yes, good. Okay, just sort of throw something from the back if the sound goes out. Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Michael very much for him and his team, Jessica Miller and others who have been making our own stay here in DC these last few days very smooth, very enjoyable, and very intellectually productive, which can only happen when all the background activities are arranged as brilliantly as they have been. So, Michael, thank you and your team very much for all of that. What I'd like to do is to follow up on Michael's thoughts on Cultural Revolution with a couple of thoughts about the topic on which I was commenting at the conference with two of our 23 participants, in this case, the Russia specialist, Stephen Lovell, and the China specialist, Jie Li, and give a couple of quick thoughts about what I took from their commentaries. I know that people here won't, for the most part, have had the chance to read them. That I hope will be amended in a little while when we finally got the papers together and published them. But until then, take this as a sneak preview. One of the themes which they tackled with great assiduity was the question of how revolutions have shaped people's ideas of space and of time, the dimensionality of the revolution, if that doesn't make it sound too much like a Hollywood B movie of the 1950s on the science fiction type of theme. And within that, I think a variety of themes came together that I think have the, as far as we can see at this stage, the potential to be very productive in terms of that comparative analysis that Michael has been talking about and that we've had running through the course of this project. Particularly that there are some phenomena that clearly China and Russia shared quite notably during the 20th century high point of both revolutions, but also points of significant difference. And I think that one of the themes, or the kind of two theme idea that runs through that conceptualization for the 20th century relates to technology and its uses and mobilization, by which you can see concrete examples. One of the things that Stephen Lovell in his paper pointed out was that the early Cold War period, the 1950s and 60s, qualified in technological terms as being the Soviet Union's jet age, when people started to traverse very, very long distances, reducing the effects of scale of space by a new and powerful technology of travel. It is fair to say that that same period did not coincide with the arrival of China's jet age. That would have to wait, well, certainly till the 1980s and 90s, but perhaps even more so, the more current period when, as I think most people in this room will know, the great financial crisis of 2008 was solved and passed by China building probably a record number of airports on its territory compared to any other country during that period of time on Earth. But other areas of technology, it emerged, clearly do have a real grip on this revolutionary period. And indeed, the period of Mao's unfolding of rule in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, well explored in many other ways, was opened up for us by Jie Li with a paper which talked about radio and broadcasting, in particular, as a means of creating both an imagined community, and Benedict Anderson's now famous phrase, but also the necessity for a wider population to deal with the effects of technology, but also the need for it to create a network which needs to be maintained, used as an instrument of state policy, and on some occasions even pushed back against in various ways. Technology could also, in China, create a variety of different ways in which revolutionary experience could be encountered. And again, for the China specialists, we might think of the experience of Chuanlian during that Cultural Revolution on the Chinese side that Michael was referencing. For those who don't know, essentially the period in which the Chinese state during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s offered up free railway travel for youth in China to get on board a train and travel essentially anywhere they wanted. Vast numbers, of course, traveled to Beijing to see Chairman Mao in Tiananmen Square, but they also traveled with each other and to see each other. And even now, some of the more nostalgic older Chinese think of that period of the Cultural Revolution as one not of terror and violence, which it undoubtedly was, but also one in which they opened up to new experiences at a time when the revolution was finding another form. The final thought that, again, I think emerged during some of that discussion was on the question of what space, territorial space in both revolutionary Russia and revolutionary China was used for. And the question of agriculture, always at the center of revolution, perhaps even more centrally in the case of China than Russia, but for both very, very relevant, came up as an important element. I know that amongst others, we have the distinguished scholar Kristen Looney here in the audience, who, of course, is an immense expert on China's comparative agricultural experience. So perhaps we'll get some thoughts later on in the discussion. No pressure. So that's one side, I think, of some of the themes of technology, mobility, and their relationship to revolutionary experience that we began to tease out. Let me say a couple of words on the other aspect, which is not space, but time. And the question of how revolutionary time differs from whatever the predecessor might be, traditional time, petit bourgeois time even. And I use that in awareness that in recent years, the term petit bourgeois, 小资, has been used as an ironic but somewhat affectionate self-description by many middle-class Chinese. One can see on social media pictures of young people in Shanghai perhaps drinking exotic-looking cocktails and writing underneath that this is making them feel very 小资. So this, of course, is a sort of ironic reappropriation of a previous class designation. It was very real and very important, of course, at the time of the revolution's height. But the question of how one can judge as a historian how these things are experienced comes to the question, which again exercise both of our authors, of sources, and in particular the question of diaries and memoirs, both of them genres that exist both in the Soviet experience and in the Chinese experience. And what I think I wanted to point out in my last comment on this, and this is actually separate from what either of the writers in our session put forward, but something that's occurred to me as I look at some of the revolutionary diaries of that period, the 1940s in particular, for my own period, for my own purposes, is how much at that time young Chinese were certainly aware of their Russian predecessors and counterparts. Certainly when it came to writing about their own subjectivity in their diaries, they wrote frequently about Soviet literature as a way of shaping their own experience. But actually, as often as not, it was not just Soviet, but Russian culture more broadly that provided them with points of reference. And the one that comes to mind is one that I think in some ways represents a wider sort of metonymy, a way of putting forward an idea that could express a great deal just by one gesture. And that has to do with one poem, which turns up a few times, particularly actually the diary of young revolutionary women. And actually here I can do a quick hand count, actually. This is not often you get to do audience participation in one of these research seminars, but I can do one now. And you'll have to, if I've got it wrong, correct my pronunciation, but Turgenev's poem, The Threshold, is it Parog, it's pronounced? How many people know that poem? Ah, okay. But Masha knows everything. So, thank you very much. She was doing my job for me there. And amongst which period would you say that the peak of it's like a conversation now? Which period was it most popular during? Right, so 1890s into the early, so pre-1917. Okay, So I'm sure you knew this because you knew this, you do really know everything about this, Marcia, but that it became immensely popular 20, 30 years later with young Chinese revolutionary women. And on at least 2 or 3 occasions that I can think of, and I'm sure there are others too, when one of those revolutionary women was about to make a gesture, in one case, so I should just say for those who don't know what the poem is, it's basically written in the voice of a dialogue between an older man and a younger woman, and the young woman is clearly about to step over the threshold of revolution, and the man says to her, do you realize that if you do this, your family will disown you, you may go to prison, you may be shot, you know, terrible things may happen. And she replies, yes, I know, but I will do this. And the last lines are, someone says, fool, and another person says, saint. And of course, you have to decide. So a copy of this poem, for instance, was left on the threshold, or at least on the doorstep of the parents of a young woman whose parents were very prominent nationalists, as in Chiang Kai-shek nationalists, anti-communists, when she basically ran off to join the communist underground in 1941. On another occasion, this poem was used in the diary of a young revolutionary woman cadre of the 46-47 period, a couple of years before the communist victory in China, again as a sort of substitute for expressing her own feelings about how she had stepped into that revolutionary life. And it's very clear from all of these that these people did see themselves as making a new era for themselves in which their own personalized experiences were clearly part of a wider trajectory of events that were shifting things into a very different sort of period of world historical time. But for these young Chinese in doing so, over and over again, the example they turned to was Russian. And that particular connection, as I say, is one that this grouping, I think, has been doing a great deal to explore. And who is going to be exploring it next, Michael?
Explorer on the Russian side, Juliana?
I need my microphone back.
Oh, sorry, you need the microphone.
Yeah, it's always a hard act to speak after Rana, especially since I'm trying to think if I have some audience participation, but maybe it will organically evolve since I have this sort of very dry sounding topic. Actually, I'm speaking about 2 of our chapters, which sort of go in tandem, Normativity and Dissent. Normativity is done by the Chinese historian Fabio Lanza, who's here, and the Soviet historian and linguist Katerina Kelly, who I guess has probably gone to bed in Cambridge, and a chapter on dissent, which of course is the flip side of fulfilling the norms. If you don't, knowingly or unknowingly, you're stepping outside and therefore are dissenter. And of course, both elements are very important in societies which relied on mobilization, both on mental mobilization and physical mobilization, and also had this demand on themselves of being fully mobilized most of the time, at least. And it didn't really leave the option of being outside that mobilization community. But of course, these norms established to ensure mobilization, of course, were also norms about defining the other. And so there were both societies which relied heavily on images and realities of and exclusion. So really, both chapters are very central to describing revolutionary societies, and even revolutionary societies. Of course, we had a lot of discussion, like when does a society stop being revolutionary? And we very early on decided that we're going to take a very wide brush to that, and we basically the end is almost open-ended because we can't even agree of, as far as I understood from today, we can't agree if socialism has ended in China or not. But therefore, we also can't agree if the revolution has ended. And in a similar case, of course, the Soviet Union, you have a collapse of the actual state structure. But of course, a lot of values, norms, and ambitions, as in fact is evidence now, survive. So it's also there one can say, is the revolution actually over, or was the revolution over by 1924 or whatever, when Lenin died? So the question which sort of is looming over both chapters is who is in it and who is not in it, and on what are the norms based that define these insides and outsides. And some of them seem to be, I mean, which is why we're comparing Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, even though, of course, they differ in detail. They have a joint worldview of being anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, based on a particular model of economy. But then you also, of course, have other norms that keep informing, and that came out of today's discussion as well, some of which are pre-revolutionary, and some of which are very traditional, going back many centuries. And they mesh and mix with these revolutionary norms. And then, of course, because societies are never as perfect as their creators or utopian dreamers want them to be, you then have another set of norms that come about as sort of the practical norms that govern everyday life, in the gaps of where ideology either doesn't tell you what to do, or it's impossible to fulfill ideology, or you just don't want to fulfill ideology. So you have the sort of other layer of official and unofficial norms, and actually, of course, I mean, as you were just doing your poem spiel, I thought, of course, literature is in both societies a huge derivative for, a huge source for norm building, and the piece of literature I know, and which is straddling both societies, is actually a book called The Young Guard by Alexandre Fadeev, which came out in 45, actually 43 the first time, then was rewritten. But as far as I understand, it was translated into Chinese and was very popular among Chinese youth. But I love to hear and be corrected if that is not so. And then, of course, so I'm just sort of going through a few themes which came to me, especially in the discussion I had with Yvonne Wong today. I mean, there's certainly categories which seem to cut across norms, which is sort of interesting in itself. One of them is gender. Being a woman means something which does not necessarily run always concurrent with the norm. So if the norm is you're a good socialist worker, but somehow as a woman, you might not ever be quite a good socialist worker, because the ideal socialist worker is a man. The typical proletarian is a man, or because other things are expected of you. As far as I understand from on the Chinese side, there was still a huge pressure to be reproducing and being reproductive, which is true for the Soviet Union in particular times, especially to replenish the loss of the Second World War, but not at all times. It sort of goes up and down with the abortion debate. Another category that seems to cut across is youth and generation. That young people have high expectations, but also high deviations. And then sort of another theme was the methods of enforcing the norms. And I'm sort of don't want to stray into your category of violence, because of course one of the major elements of enforcing norms was in fact violence in both societies. And again, violence on many levels, some of it physical, some of it mental, and pertaining to the topic, because both Yvonne and I are very into youth culture, that's sort of our natural habitat. The process of shaming, I sort of kept being stuck today of thinking that both societies know this process of public shaming and of self-criticism as an integral part of how they function, and yet they sort of seem to be different weighted. And I haven't yet got a conclusive answer of why I feel that somehow in Chinese society that seems to be of a different weight, of shaming was used in a different way. I mean, partly of course the preeminence of the Cultural Revolution, but it also seemed to have mattered more to people. And again, that goes back into like tapping into different socializations. That possibly in Soviet culture, being publicly shamed was very unpleasant, but maybe not quite as devastating as in Chinese culture. But again, something I'll want to learn more about. And then a third general theme, the force of globalization. I mean, what is actually interesting is we look at these societies, and Yvonne provided some pictures, and I don't know if anybody who, I mean, some of you were definitely yesterday at my talk about Soviet hippies. And you have these people, and actually all of them look like American hippies to some or other degree. I mean, and you think, so how is it? You have one socialist society here and another socialist society here, and actually what you have is somebody who looks like somebody from San Francisco, and where does this come from? So this cutting in of outside forces, and particularly, of course, the West as this player, I mean, and that is constantly rearing its head, and it's sort of kind of needed. I mean, you sort of almost wonder what would have happened to socialist societies if the West had gone down, if they would have gone into a crisis of identity too. Yeah, so we decided on concentrating on experience of revolution, and that, of course, this experience is very dependent on where you stand in revolutionary society. And I think some chapter we have only recently added, and was our last piece today, was on empire, which I think brings it out very clearly that if you're on the periphery of a socialist society, you have a different view than if you're at the center. If you're from a dominant group that is seen as the carrier of revolution, that might be class, that might be ethnicity, you have a different experience than if you're not. And that, of course, raises the whole question of if norms can be fulfilled, if there's the revolutionary norm is such that can be fulfilled by any subject of this revolutionary state, or if there's some subjects which who are excluded by definition. And of course, early on, that was very much a class question. If you were from a bourgeois class or aristocracy, or even intellectuals, then initially you were not part of this revolutionary process. And it definitely shifted sort of more into an ethnic question in the Soviet Union during the Second World War, when certain nations were deported as being unreliable. And of course, then later on, as a sort of national independence movements raised their heads. And related to that is the question of redemption. What are the mechanisms of redemption? Of how can you redeem yourself if you failed the norms? And something we haven't talked about as much, but which I think is central to socialist society, is the redemption through labor. The sort of labor as a prayer, almost as a confession. And of course, confession itself, self-critique, is a form of redemption. But then there's a sort of interesting one of redemption of actually shifting norms. So you don't change, but the norms change. And actually, suddenly you're not as renegade anymore as you were. And all of this becomes, of course, super interesting when in this chapter, which we have labeled Endgames, because there we have enormous norm shifts in both societies. And suddenly, who are the dissenters and who are the normatives gets a completely new dimension, which of course in the Soviet Union is cut short by the end of the Soviet Union, but I guess in China is still sort of being negotiated. Yeah, thank you.
Jen, are you ready to cross the threshold? Yes.
I'm getting some no's from here and I'm getting a yes from the left. Okay, super. All right. So we're going back to China. That's at least one threshold I'm crossing at this point. And when Michael asked us to prepare comments, and I was trying to think about what I could actually contribute after 3 phenomenal speakers ahead of me, I was thinking back to the moments when we were still traveling to China and doing research in China, and some of my earliest encounters with the Chinese vision of the Soviet Union and of Russia. And there's plenty. I mean, all of those of us who've lived in China, who've worked in China, will have encountered China's engagement with Russia. But one in particular stood out to me, and that is because I'm the one totally focused on materiality and material culture. And essentially, those are really 2 lovely scholarly words for a real interest in stuff. And the stuff that made the world. And one of these memories, and it's an odd memory, but somehow I keep coming back to it, is of a moment when I went in Beijing to the Hongqiao Pearl Market, which is near Tiantan Temple. And I remember this was the early 2000s, and I had never seen anything like it. I was surrounded by thousands of pearls of different colors, gemstones. It was just an entire world of stones. And I was sort of trying to make sense of this incredibly overwhelming, sumptuous environment. And I was starting to see lots of international visitors going through, trying to find the best stores, trying to sort out, where are we going to get the best deals, the best quality pearls. That's also where I learned that in order to know whether you have a good pearl, you have to burn it. As I sat there, I And by the way, the Chinese pearl market obviously would fundamentally change the culture of pearls globally. So there's a real story there. But as I sat there in one of the stores, I was struck by a elderly saleswoman who was speaking fluently in Russian with a group of about aged 40 salespeople. And she was having all of her conversations in Russia, and they were clearly sort of having these deals. And younger Chinese who had taken me to the market then explained to me, and I thought this was interesting. They explained that she was somebody who had grown up after liberation, and that meant the early years immediately after 1949. In other words, she had learned Russian as part of sort of 1950s education, and she was fluent, but not just fluent in terms of knowing the language. She could really engage. It was an incredible level of fluency, and it was absolutely stunning. And in a way, it was a reminder in that moment, which today I think is increasingly rare, of that period in Chinese history in which, as people were then told, the Soviet Union today at that moment was going to be China's tomorrow. And when I talked to these salespeople, and obviously I couldn't help myself, I had to talk to her and to other people who were speaking in Russian. They would tell stories of how they had learned about the Soviet Union. And these are the kind of histories that I think are comparative and entangled studies. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're sort of bridging that gap between thinking about the comparative dimension, which sometimes has gone, well, I think has gone a bit lost in the way we work as historians, and these questions of entanglement and how we bring them together. And exactly these are the, as I said, these are the histories that our studies seek to draw attention to. And I think this is a really ambitious and it's a really exciting project. So thank you for including me. I've had an absolute fantastic journey so far, and I think it's going to continue. Now, I'm a China scholar, which means I think in numbers, and there are 2 points I took away and 3 themes. I had to do this. This is such a Chinese theme. I had to do it. And now, two points that stood out for me in our discussions. First of all, was that the Sino-Soviet interactions, they were substantial and they were not even dominantly imposed top-down. And I think this is really important to remember. There was genuine, as Juliana and Rana and Michael were talking about earlier, there was genuine enthusiasm about the possibility of actual world revolution, about the possibility that China would become, enthusiasm in China, but also outside, that China would become the leader of a socialist movement of anti-colonization and people's liberation outside of Europe. Many saw Maoism, and this is a term when there's quite a bit of debate. I use it because I do see in it a genuine, and many others do as well, a genuine vision of revolutionary theory and revolutionary praxis that would enable other groups and young states to find their own revolutionary path. And I think a lot of colleagues, Fabio Lanza and others, have really worked on this to show, you know, we need to take this stuff seriously. So in other words, while China might have been as opposed sort of the younger brother in some regards, it was not a satellite, it was not a copy with some local variations. It was a distinctive vision. And during the era under the rule of Mao, it was a state and a society that sought to put this vision into practice, with many people trying to, as they called it, make revolution. And this, for somebody who works on materiality, is an incredibly interesting use of a verb. You're making revolution. You're not revolutionizing, you're making it in daily life and elsewhere. So this was one of my 2 points. The second one was that these experiences of revolution, as I just alluded to, were therefore profoundly material. And if we really think about the language that goes into this moment, it is all about doing, making, changing, practice. It is really, it's a forward-looking language, from everyday life to economics exchange at the small as well as at the large level, to cultural imaginaries, to literary worlds, political education, and so on. Now, these 2 points are obviously not new, but they do bear, I think, repeating, because somehow at times we lose sight of them. And I think this project is great because it brings us back to it. It draws our attention back to these points. Now, for my 2 points to my 3 themes. And 3 is such a thing. I obviously had to put in a 3 here. Now, these 3 themes that I have derived from those that I thought were quite prominent in our Sergei Ushakin and my discussion and in the section on materiality, but I also think in the discussions we had more generally, many of which had a material dimension. There was a material dimension in almost every single section we talked about. So the 3 themes essentially are: who made revolution, what was it to be made of, and how would it travel? So how would it be made in travels? Now, the first theme, who made revolution? So it's sort of, for me, a question. It's a big question, but one also about, you know, would it be the party or would it be people? who made revolution. So this is in a way something we discussed in a very comparative dimension. And what emerged, at least as dominant themes, not exclusively, but dominant themes, was the role of top-down planning in the Soviet Union versus the incredible emphasis on grassroots mobilization and people locally making stuff in the People's Republic of China. And it's a bit of a lapside sort of simplistic way of looking at it, but it worked for us as a thought piece, was to think about this term that comes up again and again, namely social engineering. And where we've thought actually, and again, this is overly simplified, but we thought it quite helpful. In a way, the Soviet Union was all about the engineering. So it was social engineering, but with engineering writ large. So in the case, for instance, of material culture, you have planners setting out how to standardize spaces, thinking about how to create new environments, how to live a socialist life, how to have sort of a socialist person. And there's a lot of discourse about that. Now you have a similar discourse in China as well, but in China, in terms of the social engineering, the social bit is really important. So there's a great bit of focus, especially in the 50s, but also later, on the role of localities, the possibility of experimentation, the possibility of finding solutions to bring about communism at the local level. So the idea that maybe the solution for how we get to communism is in communities, it is with people, and we have to find it, and we have to enable people or force them. And this is where we get back to topics of violence, of course, to create and make revolution. So in other words, if in the USSR, top-down planning was often seen as the path to socialism and then communist utopia, in China, while there is planning, there's a lot of emphasis on local initiative, local responsibility, and the possibility of local communities bringing about communism. Now, the second theme, I promised three. The second theme, which is also comparative, is that of socialist materiality, which we had quite a bit of discussions about, and which is a really exciting way of thinking about the period under Mao's rule, or in other words, what the revolution was actually made of. And while we should look at what people had or did not have, I think we should also ask how people understood the material world of socialism and how it was to be created in both countries, and to actually think about how those ideas were in communication or not. Now, one of the things Sergei Ushakin's commentary brought out is the relevance of essentially a socialist thing theory. Now, for those of you who do material culture or stuff studies, you will have often encountered this idea of materiality. It goes back to, actor network theory, Bruno Latour, etc. Well, it turns out the socialist world was there about 100 years ago. I mean, others were there even earlier, but in terms of a modern idea, we've had this thing for a while. And so it was quite fascinating to think about how throughout this socialist project, this revolutionary project, people were debating how to make life beautiful and functional with things that were meant to have use value and be pure in design and designed to address needs, rather than things being commodities that would need to produce surplus value, raise desires, and be designed to make people want more all the time. And there's an interesting overlap here between Soviet and a Maoist concern with means of production and things in connection with humans, what humans would be able to do with objects to change the world. In other words, so I worked at one point about bamboo objects, and the interesting thing was that bamboo itself was never socialist, but the objects made of bamboo, the processes by which they were meant to be made, that was meant to make these objects socialist, so that it is sort of in the connection between people and objects, people and tools, that the actual process of socialist construction happens. Now, the third theme, and then I'm going to shut up quite soon, is the theme of, quite simply, and that's an entangled story of stuff matters. Now, we talked about the literary world, but of course, in addition to these amazing bestsellers, Soviet bestsellers in China, How the Steel Was Tempered, the story of Zoya and Shura, they were total bestsellers selling in the million. You, of course, also had things like Soviet fashion that Antonia Finane has talked about. The question of what sort of skirts would you wear, what sort of patterns, international fashion conventions. You have the import of synthetic fibers. You have Chinese products that are popular across Eurasia, light industrial goods, silks and textiles, leather products, sweets, apparently also mushrooms. I'm looking into this, but apparently mushrooms traveled, as did eggs and hair, who knew? And so in other words, China was part of a socialist cultural world, as well as what Bill Kirby has called a socialist world economy. And, you know, I'm delighted that we have a materiality section, and it's also really great to see sort of experiences being explored in this really comprehensive, multifaceted way. And
Thank you so much, Jen. And last but not least, Maria will talk about something that people have been aware of for quite a while, violence, but new takes on it.
Well, if you're talking over here, you won't need it on. For the
Oh,
slides.
great. Let's switch it off.
And just take care of the cords. Okay.
So,
Sorry, one moment. Sorry. There we
Uh,
go. And then go.
Good evening. My name is Maria Mayofis, and I'm responsible for the section of revolutionary violence, which we are doing together with Cynthia Hooper, who is here with us, and with Julia Strauss, who is apparently on Zoom, but I'm not sure whether she's still here. So after these 4 very thoughtful talks, you'll now have something like a children's cartoon. So what I was thinking about during our today's section, and when I read the papers we got for our section, was not just the legacy of revolutionary violence, but its remnants on the anthropological level. So I will start with an episode from my family history. And this is a book written by my grandfather and published in 1955 in the main publishing house for children's literature in the USSR. It's entitled Pуть телеграммы in Russian, which is telegram's route. Yes. And in the very same year, I believe, it was translated to Chinese and came out in Beijing. I had the Chinese copy, hard copy, on my bookshelves, and I was staring at it like for years. But I have it now just in my Moscow apartment, so I wasn't able to find a photo of the Chinese edition, so just the Russian one. This book is very neatly written. It was very, I would say, intelligible. And I know that Samuel Marshak, a prominent Russian children's poet and editor, helped my grandfather to prepare this text for publication. So we can say that this book could become a perfect object for analysis, for example, for our time and space section, where we talked much about technologies uniting different people, different spaces, different regions. But it could also become a good object for example, our normativity section, because it's about popular science and transmitting some models of popular science from the USSR to China. But yesterday evening, I realized that the author of the book, I mean my grandfather, could become a perfect protagonist for our violence section. Although he didn't serve in the secret police or in the army, he was an engineer at the Central Telegraph in Moscow. But in the same year, this book came out. He wrote, you see, this is the, from the back side of the book, this information is about when it was approved by censorship and when it was sent to print. It was April 1955. And in the same month, my grandfather wrote a letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party asking to reconsider the criminal case of his father, a prominent Soviet doctor and scientist, Wolf Bronner, who was arrested, accused of being a German, British, Japanese, and I don't remember what else spy. And he was condemned to death in 1939. And this is the text of this letter. I think it's well seen on the screen. Left column, Russian original, right column, English translation. I'll read it aloud. I have no doubt that Wolf Bronner's case was the work of Berier's gang, one of whose dirty goals was to defame and destroy the progressive intelligentsia devoted to the party and the Soviet people. I asked the Central Committee to issue a directive to reconsider the case of communist Wolf Bronner. I know that he has been dead a long time. After all, he would be 80 years old now, and that's why I wasn't in a rush to submit this appeal, considering the amount of work involved in the cases of victims of the Beria Bakumov gang who are still alive. However, I believe that is also time to resolve Wolf Bronner's case once and for all, and to restore the reputation of the scientist revolutionary, who was one recognized by the Soviet government with one of the first titles of honored scientist awarded in the country. So what we see here, that a person who doesn't serve in the secret police, who doesn't kill people, who doesn't imprison people, he is appealing to the Central Committee saying my father is innocent, he's not guilty, but he has to adopt this particular language of violence. And I am sure he was well aware that in October 1937, when my grandfather was arrested, Beria was still working in Georgia as a first secretary of the Communist Party of Georgia, who he wasn't responsible for the arrest of my grandfather. And nevertheless, my grandfather knew that in order to have this case to be reconsidered, he had to use these particular words and to be in this particular language. So here I am switching on to our violence section, and I have two quotations. One from the very last paragraphs of Cynthia's paper, who I think proposed a very brilliant idea that has to be developed. She says, participation in the idiom of violence was required even to protest innocence successfully. Engaging with the regime, even critically, but as a citizen rather than a traitor, required acceptance of repressive practice. And the second quotation, very short one, which I have from the article of the famous Russian literary scholar Maria Chudakova, who died little more than a year ago. This article is entitled Language of Decaying Civilization, so about Soviet civilization. And in this article, she argues that there was a special mode of language usage in the USSR, which she calls magical. What does she mean by this word? She insists that in order to direct violence on a certain person or a group, or to avoid violence yourself, a person had to stick to a certain language of violence, like a magical language that could save him, her, or bring some threat to other people. And this is, I think, that what can be added to our discussion on violence that started today. But I'm now coming back to the book on Telegram, And I would like to say that, frankly speaking, one could barely get rid of this experience of violence, affecting the language, including affecting the language, the mindset, the worldview, including being a participant of a certain practices of violence. But we should always keep in mind that these were the same people living on different levels, switching to and from diverse regimes of involvement in certain practices. And living through all these experiences simultaneously, they gained relatively high degree of agency on the level of professional self-realization, as we can see here, but it can be seen also, for example, in the cases of peasants' biographies or workers' biographies, not just intellectuals. And at the same time, relatively low level of agency in terms of their personal impact on decreasing state violence, as we see here also. So the conclusion is these are the very same people living with normativity, living with materiality, living with technologies and space and time, and with violence also. Thank you.
Wow, so I am in awe of my co-organizers, and it was such a pleasure to listen to you. But as usual, you overfulfilled the plan. And so all our planning goes out the window and we'll improvise like both China and the Soviet Union did. And instead of now, I would like to open the floor to anyone who has comments or questions, including our participants, but also members of the audience. So since we have a chunk of time now for discussion. So who would like to begin? Yes, and please just tell us who you are and just identify yourself. Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg again of this one. I teach Russian history here. So I'm curious about a really important aspect of the revolutionary experience in both countries, which is working through the legacy of the previous regime. Well, -1 or 2, I guess. It's interesting to me that by the time the Chinese Revolution actually takes place and Mao takes over, the Soviets have already moved on to justifying the imperial practices of Imperial Russia in especially the Far East, territory that it annexes from China. So I guess my question is kind of on two levels. One is these are both revolutionary regimes that are inheriting a certain multi-ethnicity from their imperial predecessors, but interpreting that legacy in very different ways. As far as I understand, the Chinese model is far less attentive to the rights of nationalities than the Soviet one is. So that's on kind of like one level. And then the other level is, why is there such disagreement between the two regimes? I mean, obviously there's like practical reasons, but I'm curious about the ideological side about whether, for example, the Treaty of Peking of 1860 was, an unequal treaty or not. These are pretty fundamental questions for their relationship. So, for all their similarities, why couldn't they come to a sense of common ground about that legacy? And why did they diverge rather than converge, despite their shared legacies on that front?
That's Jim Millward is our expert on the imperial side of things. Do you have any thoughts on this?
First, I'd say take a little issue with the word inherit, although this isn't the thrust of you. In the Chinese case, certainly, after the act, So I guess the main thrust of your question concerns the kind of implementation of nationalities policies in both places, and you had mentioned, and I think correctly, that there was rights of minorities or the rights of non in both. So I guess I'd say this is something we were talking about earlier. The thesis about that sort of stronger nationalistic character of the Chinese Revolution than in the names. It's the People's Republic of China, not the Russian. This is someplace where I don't have an interlocutor working on the Russian side because I think we're certainly seeing what's going on in China now, a very strong assertion of Chinese nationalistic aspect of what PRC stands for and what the Chinese Communist Party stands for, to the extent that it is not openly abandoning the Stalinist Soviet model of nationality policy. It is working around it, and it is coming up with all sorts of ways to actually down like that. And the original, one of the strongest differences is in the implementation of that policy, which on a superficial level looks somewhat similar to the Soviet model, but the fact that in PRC autonomous regions were created and not republics, even nominal republics. This is something we take note of when looking at nationality policies. But I don't think it's actually quite it's a very profound difference, one that actually turned out to have a profound legacy. So that would be that it really was a nationalist revolution in China with communist characteristics.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions and comments? Yeah. Just tell us who you are so everyone knows.
Hello, my name is Kristen Looney. I'm in the Asian Studies program in the government department here at Georgetown, and my field is Chinese politics. And I'm wondering if in your comparisons, the sent down youth movement in China was discussed. I'm really interested in youth and mobilization and agriculture and the intersection of those things. And one thing related to my there's a reinterpretation of the sent down youth movement in China that I think has that's happened within political circles within the party, and it's a interpretation of what happened in the 60s and 70s. And there are programs within China today, I'm talking about recently in the past, decade and a half or so, to kind of incentivize youth to go to the countryside and serve there as a way of becoming better communists and better public servants and better future party leaders. And as part of that drive, the story of Xi Jinping's own experience of being, a young person in Liangjiahe, Shanxi province, a sent down youth, had, that being a formative experience, that story is told over and over again. And there is a kind of equivalent in Russia, under Putin. Is there a discussion of kind of these moments of Russian history that maybe were looked upon previously as moments of tragedy, but reinterpreted as positive moments when, urban youth or workers were mobilized to go to the countryside, this being something that they want to revive? I'm just wondering if there are equivalents to what I've observed in China. Thank you.
Take that? Okay. I might add a few words.
Yeah, very, very interesting question as somebody who's also interested in youth. I mean, there is an equivalent, but it leaves out the tragedy. There is a certain, a fair amount of nostalgia of all these trips young people had to do to bring in potatoes or build buildings. And especially in the 60s and 70s, it was actually mandatory over the summer for students studying at university to go and do this manual labor. And it was mostly located in the countryside or definitely outside the big urban centers. And of course, there was also a time when young people were sort of among themselves and they had to do some hard labor. But there's a very big nostalgia surrounding that. It just never went through that sort of tragedy side. I think nobody ever considered that a tragedy, even though, of course, it was a complete waste of resources to have these highly educated people who actually were not very good in harvesting potatoes or building sheds to go to the countryside. So, but I think there might have been a moment when people resented that. I mean, I did a lot of interviews, and I certainly have interviews of people who were being sent to labor, but I see it very much as a personal tragedy. So because they had to conform to a group. In general, however, the nostalgic element survives. And I don't know if there's any of other elements which used to be considered tragic quite in a sort of kind of flip side, but
I just want to add that I have my own microphone. Like I said, under Putin, it's been selection of tragic cataclysms, notably World War II and the Great Fatherland War, but in a completely heroic vein that sanitizes them. And they have been, it's now a far-right regime, not a continuation, which is another big difference. And so they have repudiated or partially repudiated certain elements of the Soviet past while adopting many of the practices and playing up its sort of great power status. But the anniversary of the revolution was almost ignored officially in 2017. The other big difference, of course, is the difference between the countryside in both. That's something that's traditionally been made a big deal of in terms of Maoism versus Stalinism, and recently reconsidered with Lucien Bianco's French historian's work, which tries to show that both regimes in a way had a lot of similarities in relationship to the countryside, but still the post-collectivization countryside in the Soviet Union was depopulated and sort of permanently scarred, and the out-migration just increased, sort of throughout the post-war decades. And the only equivalent that I was trying to think of, this phenomenon of being sent down, not only of youth, but of intellectuals, who Barbara Mittler points out, often transform those communities in some culturally, in terms of hygiene and unexpected consequences of that whole phenomenon. There's the only equivalent, I mean, there was a brief mobilization of urban workers during collectivization, but that was regime-sponsored, favored workers, the 25,000ers, and it was a much smaller phenomenon. But in World War II, you have the forced evacuation when the Germans advanced of many of the cultural institutions of Moscow and Leningrad. And this was a sign of how much they valued high culture in this Stalinist system. They spent incredible resources in the midst of this war for survival to evacuate those intelligentsia groups, museums, institutions, and they had a real effect during the war years on the so-called provinces and the regional cities. So there is maybe some comparison to be made, but then it sort of went back. They all wanted to go back after the war, and that reinforced the kind of spatial hierarchy and centralization of the system. Anyone else?
Hi, thank you so much for that. My question is about urban space. So I wondered if your discussions had touched about the Russian and Chinese approaches to the transformation of urban space. So in the production of space, Henri Lefebvre makes this kind of throwaway remark that the Chinese had this much more democratic and grassroots approach to transforming space. And I wonder if that's borne out by your observations. And I also wanted to ask about domesticity and about the home. So in the Khrushchev era, there arose this discourse about comfort and about domesticity. And I wonder if there's an equivalent discourse in the Chinese case, and if there isn't, why not? So thank you so much.
Sure.
Right here.
Yeah, the left test is full of this little thing about agent space that just come out of nowhere and go nowhere. And I love it. No. There was no attempt originally. I mean, in the very early PRC, there is an attempt to plan of the space in the Soviet way. There's Soviet specialists coming in, and there's a massive debate. Especially sometimes with the Soviet advisor calling for more rational implementation was originally, I'm sorry, I'll be brief, but there was originally an assignment, the Chinese plan assigned the average Chinese urban dweller should have 9 square meters of personal space in the city capital, which was insane. I mean, they were like probably more than that office. And so they try to plan accordingly, and there's a massive failure. It doesn't work. There's a continual attempt to plan, at least in Sweden City, I would say for sure Beijing and some major cities, but it cannot be done because there's a massive population, the infrastructure is falling apart, and it's a problem that lags until at the very end of now period. So much so that during the Cultural Revolution, we try to push the building of new buildings. It's a massive out and these things are so bad, that they fall apart. And by the way, I don't want to dismiss the urban attempt. This is a massive attempt to improve the life of the city, but they go against a population influx that is continuous, and and even with the Hukou system and with the implementation of residential, it cannot be stopped. And so you have in many ways the legacy of some cities there, which are massively destroyed. The old city is gone. It's in part the legacy of this. The failed attempt to solve the problem in certain period. Some stuff is so old, and then not that. Yeah, sorry, brief answer to that. So there is stuff down planning, but that's important. There's a fair amount of bottom up.
And then moving to the inside of the houses. And it's a very good question. And I'm sort of, when we think about comfort and the Khrushchev area, of course, it's Susan Reed and many other who have written phenomenal work on what happened in the 1960s and after in the Soviet Union. So you do have some discussions about how people should live, how they should how their interiors should look like, how the home should look like in the 1950s, 60s, and sort of very early 70s, and I'm saying this for a reason. But you don't have anything quite comparable at the same time as the conversations are happening in Khrushchev era Soviet Union, partially because that's seen as a return to bourgeois living. And so the idea is, we have to come up with ways that people can live, but it's not about, who's going to get the best sofa and where do you get your sofa from. If I gather correctly, in the Soviet Union, this is the time when people are starting to talk about, is it Bulgarian sofas that are really in and where you're getting your furniture from? And there's like this whole, this whole, it's
Eastern Germany.
Interestingly, designers are looking at what's happening there, but then sort of there's a great leap forward moment and then it just disappears again. But in terms of comparison, I would say around 1973, 74, interestingly, before the official end of the Cultural Revolution, we start to see an increased concern for how to interior decorate homes. They start setting up all these research units for furniture and for interior design. So this is happening at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. And then it's sort of that moment that we get into the 1980s, where it helps to think in some ways as the 1980s being comparable to the 1960s in terms of the socialist domesticity and the idea that you can have a comfortable home, and that might actually be it's not a dangerous place. It's a place where socialism may actually be made and materially lived.
We have time for maybe one or two more comments or questions. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is. I have a question to Maria. I mean, it's not a question. So put telegram. There's any copies or any original book? Not original. I mean, maybe copy of book. If any website or any other place I can get it.
Well, the pictures I uploaded here were taken from some. Excuse me. The pictures I uploaded here were taken from some Ukrainian website which sells originals of the books. Not Russian, but Ukrainian. I don't know why. It's certainly available in like central libraries in Russia, and I think there should be at least one copy in the US. Let's check it. But I'm not sure whether the Chinese edition is available here. So today I was trying, in the morning, I was trying to find the photocopy of the book cover of the Chinese edition, but with no good result. But I have this hard copy in my Moscow apartment, so it certainly existed in the print run.
I was wondering if it might be fitting to end a few words on the Revolutionary Endgames. Klaus, are you able to say a few words about the comparisons that came out in our discussion? Because we bring this whole volume down to the present day, where the Russia-China relationship has become really crucial in the world again.
Yes, so I'm the moderator and commentator for the section that deals with Revolutionary Endgames, and there are papers, and they both look in of the revolutionary project in China, because it's still ongoing. In China, although but officially, and famous book in the 80s, nobody, but then was the minority, but we never caught on officially. So what we are doing here is that we are also comparing these two cultures. There was a what in Russia and in China appeared determination to reform social. I think that was actually even if these countries wouldn't speak to each other because they were since the Sino-Soviet conflict in a deep disagreement. But in both leaderships, there was the determination to reform socialism. But also, they were comparable in many ways. It was deemed necessary. Because on one hand, in Russia, after while China embarked on a path of accelerated economic reform, but maintained or strengthened even authoritarian system. And so one of the things that the section will discuss what are the factors that explain extremely different outcomes, both on the reform socialism. In one case, we have a collapse, in the other case, we have something very unexpected. Many And to make that short, I think we have been, we have been thinking about a couple of factors that come to my mind, but I think further. And it is one of the most fascinating questions that have for our world. And there's certainly that China makes use of a unique internet infrastructure, namely it opens up to the United States, it becomes a stream player, and has opened to the United States, of course, means the West means an enormous influx of the West. For many years, China is actually the player in the world that affects the most direct foreign investment, which is quite enormous. But it's also that China's strength market control. There has been the big reformer in the China case of the market power at almost all parts. Just think about Tiananmen massacre when people even demonstrators were shut down on Tiananmen Square. And I think also as a part of the explanation has to be that the strategy in the China case is different. The strategy in China's case is one step by step. It's experimental, gradual, communistic, while the Soviet Union will happen either intentionally or unintentionally. It's sort of a big bang, namely an opening abolishing the press control, abolishing that part of it practically overnight with the effect of part of that of a long-term view. So these are some of the factors that we are looking at, but at this point.
Thank you. And then for the record, that was Klaus Mühlhahn of the Zeppelin University in Germany. And I would just add a footnote in that the two countries were observing each other extremely closely. The Soviets were observing Deng Xiaoping's reforms before, and then the Chinese, of course, became acutely aware of the Soviet collapse. And so this is also both as all of this is a comparative and an interactive or entangled story. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. Please join us for a reception. Thank you very much.